Mike Maddux is back. The Rangers have hired their pitching coach. They've also made a move for the front office, bringing in former Royals GM Dayton Moore as a senior assistant. What does that mean for the Rangers, and what does that mean for their franchise moving forward? All that and more on this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked onto the Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Texas Rangers fan since 2010, the founder and host for all 4 seasons of this Locked On Rangers podcast. Thank y'all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. If you're not already, you can follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick. You can follow the show at Locked On Rangers and subscribe on YouTube, where the best way you can help grow the show is to comment any single thing below. On today's show, we are getting into the news of the Rangers making the hopefully probable final hire for their coaching staff and for their front office and what all that means. Now, the Rangers PR announced this a couple of hours ago. Of course, I was away from my phone. The one time I was actually away from my phone all day, going to the gym, trying to be healthy, and the Rangers go ahead and break news while I'm not looking at it. Shocking. At least they didn't do it while I was recording the episode like they've done before. But Rangers PR announced 2 hours ago that they have hired Dayton Moore as senior advisor, baseball operations, and Mike Maddux as pitching coach on manager Bruce Bochy's major league staff. Now, let's start with the good news. The good news here is Mike Maddux is back. He is the former Rangers pitching coach. He has been with St. Louis for the past 6 years. 6 years. Since 2017 was when he was hired. Maybe that's 5 seasons. But he decided to leave the Cardinals after this year, and he is coming back to Texas. The Rangers have a seasoned veteran, a guy who has familiarity with the organization, was the pitching coach during the best pitching years of the Rangers staff, the best years of this Rangers franchise. He was there, and he was playing an integral part in that role. And when he came in, he spent 6 seasons with the Milwaukee Brewers, including when CC Sabathia was there before he left for the Yankees. And he brought the Rangers ERA as a team down a whole run in his first season, 2009. It was coming off of a horrendous year. That 2009 team was kind of the forgotten team of that, right before kind of the sign of like, all right, things are starting to kick off. This team is actually about ready to be good and be good for quite a long time. And 2008 was not a great season. The Rangers had a 5.37 ERA as a team. I think that was from 2000 to 2008, produced an AL worst 5.14 ERA. And they hadn't had a team ERA below 4.0 since, 1990. It was just not great before Mike Maddux showed up, and he did a fantastic job of just knowing his pitchers and kind of taking these guys under his wing that were not always the best, and he kind of got the best out of them. That was one of the things that he did really, really well. We all know and love the shoulder grab, but we'll get into a little bit more of Mike Maddux. The guy who you might not know as much about is Dayton Moore. He is the former GM of the Kansas City Royals. The Royals won a World Series back in 2015, went to a World Series in 2014, but lost on some even year magic from the Giants and Bruce Bochy, actually. So that'll be kind of interesting. Bochy has beaten the Rangers in one of his World Series and the new senior assistant to the GM in one of the other World Series. Now they just need to get somebody from whoever they beat in 2016. I honestly don't even remember who that was. To complete the Triforce, if you will. But anyway, this is an interesting hire. Moore was a longtime GM with the Royals, was there has been in baseball for a long, long time. In 94, that's when he started his kind of career as a Braves scout. In 2009, that's when he was, in August 31st of 2009, that's when Moore was signed to be, excuse me. He got there in 2006. In 2009 was when he was extended. Then he kind of brought about the, glory days, which is just 2 years, really, of the Kansas City Royals. Not a whole lot of success outside of those 2 years, to be honest. He went to the World Series and lost in Game 7, 2014. Won the World Series 4-1 against the Mets in 2015. And outside of that, not a whole lot to show for it. There's been not a whole lot to show for it in Kansas City, predating him for a long, long time. And probably after he leaves, they're probably not going to be really great or even okay for a while. They're still a really young team and not a whole lot of depth in their system like you would expect for a team that has had so many losing seasons. And I'm a little concerned that this is more of a kind of pity and familiarity hire, because back on that 2015 Kansas City Royals squad, there was a guy named, Chris Young. He won his World Series with that team. I believe that was one of the final years of his career. He was 36 back then. I think he also pitched it with the Royals. No. It was just those final 3 years of his career were spent in Kansas City from 2015 to 2017. That's where he ended his career. So maybe it's a repayment of, hey, you let me win a World Series, so we'll have you come along. And there is some value in having a guy around who's been around the league for a long time, who has a lot of relationships, who kind of knows generally what it takes to run a front office. Chris Young doesn't have that since the Rangers fired John Daniels, who is now in basically this exact same role in Tampa Bay, a team that has been much better about their front office moves and smarter. And they thought, we could use this guy. It's almost like the Rangers were a little too fast to fire John Daniels. Where have I said that before? Oh, yeah, basically since it freaking happened. It was a, big pouty power move from Rangers ownership of like, hey, look, I can swing my arm around and fire people because, I own the team. Like, okay, yeah, you can. Doesn't mean you should. Doesn't mean it's a good idea. Yeah, maybe you're right, but like if you want to make a team worse, just to prove that you exist, stomping around, well, we've seen what Jerry Jones has done with the Cowboys for the past, 30, whatever year, my entire lifetime since he has been there. So, yeah, it feels like a bit of a weird move. I guess there is some sense in it, but there's another guy who was a former GM of a team that won a World Series and it's been around a lot of other smarter front offices, and James Click, former Astros GM, who they fired after winning a World Series because he had the audacity to ask for a multi-year contract extension. And he's right freaking there. You could have appealed to his spite and his bitterness. Say, hey, why don't you come help the in-state rivals stick it to your former team that didn't think you were good enough to get a multi-year contract extension after winning a freaking World Series? I don't know. Just me. Just me. I'll get more into that later, a little bit more about Mike Maddux and a little bit more about this whole situation. First, this episode is brought to you by SimpliSafe. Did you know over the holidays, property crimes like burglaries, package thefts spike nationally? That's why our friends at SimpliSafe Home Security are offering 50% off their award-winning security system so that more families can feel safe and secure this holiday season. Order your SimpliSafe system for half off today and enjoy more advanced security with greater peace of mind this holiday season. Here is why you'll love it. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents using Fast Protect technology exclusively from SimpliSafe to capture critical evidence and verify that the threat is real so you can get priority police response. Don't miss your chance to save big on the only security system I recommend. Get 50% off new SimpliSafe system at simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb. This is their biggest discount of the year, so don't wait. That's simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Now let's look a little bit about what our boy, what the guy, the GOAT, the best Rangers pitching coach, I think. I feel like it's fair to say he's pretty much been the best since in the Rangers franchise history. I don't know a whole lot about the pitching success before I was born. I have looked into it. It has not been good. There's been a reason it has not been good. Globe Life Field, the ballpark in Arlington, excuse me, I don't know why I'm calling it the other thing. The ballpark in Arlington and the other stadium whose name I can't remember that came before it were not exactly the most pitcher-friendly parks. The conditions of pitching in Texas in the summer were difficult, and Mike Maddux kind of did a great job of figuring out how to make the best of those and get the best out of the pitchers that he had. You remember the 2000 11 staff. There was not a whole lot of like all-time great guys there, but he got the most out of the guys that were there. I mean, Matt Harrison had a fantastic season. Derek Holland was at his best. Colby Lewis, C.J. Wilson, Alexi Ogando. That was the Rangers pitching staff back then. They had a fantastic season. Had a decent bullpen, but not great. But he always got the most out of those guys. Obviously, Tali Feliz was holding it down in that bullpen. Mark Lowe was present. He did some things. Darren Oliver was pretty darn good. And other than that, not a whole lot of other really great guys there. Tommy Hunter definitely had his moments. Same with Darren O'Day over the course of his time here. Koji Wahara, Mike Adams, those guys had their moments for sure. But for the most part, he just did a really great job of getting the most out of these guys who were not necessarily the all-star elites. And, Cliff Lee is probably, well, him and Yu Darvish are the two. Well, I guess also Cole Hamels was there for just a little bit of his tenure there. But look at this 2015 pitching staff that got the Rangers to the playoffs. They did end up picking up Cole Hamels at the trade deadline, but it was, started frontline. The most innings were pitched by Colby Lewis in his age 35 season. Also had a 29-year-old Giovanni Gallardo, Nick Martinez, Wandy Rodriguez, and Martin Perez were the others holding it down on that staff. Not a whole lot of greatness there, but still, the Rangers got the most out of their guys. Yet again, Keone Kela, Sam Freeman, Sean Tollison in the bullpen doing work there. But that is kind of the hallmark of the Mike Maddux pitching staff experience. He gets the most out of these guys. So is there another level to get out of some of these guys kind of towards the middle of the Ranger rotation? Is there a little bit more to get out of John Gray? I think there is. I think the Rangers have done a really great job of using analytics to kind of see that slider and give him the sweeper pitch that kind of helped him, and I think helped Dane Dunning out a little bit this year. I think there is a little bit more to get out of Dane Dunning. It's just about keeping him healthy. I'm not sure how long that hip injury is going to keep him out, when he is finally going to be able to join the Rangers in spring training. They said that he is going to be ready for opening day. Not entirely sure that's going to be true, but I don't think there'll be too much more that he'll have to wait. I don't think he's going to miss a significant portion of the season unless something bad happens while he's rehabbing, which I don't think that's going to happen. Hoping and praying that he'll be just fine. But I'm excited about the Mike Maddux hire. Get some familiarity in here. Get a guy who has done a pretty good job at most of the places that he has been. You look at his Cardinal staff, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of those early 2010s Rangers pitching staffs. I mean, you had Adam Wainwright, who is like the guy. But outside of him, there was not a whole lot of like greatness there. I mean, Ryan Helsley, their closer, was absolutely fantastic this year. But outside of that, the bullpen was not the most rock solid. They did get a decent bit out of these two trade acquisitions they got at the deadline, Jose Quintana and Jordan Montgomery. Both of them were fantastic for them. They did have a 40-year-old Adam Wainwright who still pitched 191 innings at his age and is going to come back and probably going to be pretty darn good at 3.71 ERA. That's fine. And Miles Michaelis was the one heading the rotation. Kind of gives me a little bit of C.J. Wilson vibes of, oh, this guy kind of came out of nowhere and was pretty darn good. Not elite, but pretty darn good, and was their number one. I think they'll probably spend some big money in free agency. They'll probably miss Mike Maddux. I think he's a really great pitching coach. And, honestly, who knows the amount of effort or how amount of input and difference that they make. I think they make a decent amount of difference. Sometimes we can overrate that, but I think just having a guy who is this sound, I know fans will definitely like it. I like it, just having a guy who was with the Rangers in the glory days around. Having those guys is just a nice little sentimental touch, but I also think that he is a really good pitching coach. He is not anyone who has worked with Bruce Bochy before, but again, I'm pretty sure Bruce Bochy can get along with just about everyone, and that kind of seems like that'll be the end of the additions to the coaching staff, unless there's some new position outside of the associate manager who they hired, which I don't know what that does. Also, never heard of an offensive coordinator, which is Donnie Ecker's role, but seems like he's going to be back. Seems like Tim Hires is going to be back as the hitting coach. Seems like Tony Beasley is going to be back. Everyone else is going to be pretty much back to what they were doing before, outside of the pitching coaches. Maybe I think they still haven't hired a bullpen coach. Maybe that's the only one that they have to hire. But predicting who they're going to pick as their bullpen coach is like picking a needle in the haystack. I'm sure there's a million candidates, and I don't exactly have any idea of who they're going to hire. I don't think really anybody else does either that is not in that Rangers front office or on the coaching staff at this moment. But very excited to bring the guy, the GOAT, Mike Maddux, back to Texas. Ready for some of those patented shoulder grabs on the mound visits. The first one, I'm going to lose my freaking mind, especially if the first one comes on opening day to Jacob deGrom. I'm going to lose my freaking mind if I see that. Just the waves of sentimentality are going to overcome me, and it's going to be beautiful. Coming up, we're going to get into a little bit more about Dayton Moore, why I have some concerns with him, and some of the big concerns from our Locked On Royals host, Ryan Stiles, and why he is very happy to be rid of Dayton Moore, and why we should be concerned that he is coming to Texas. But first, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball to soccer to esports, we've got it all at BetOnline. There are some World Cup bets that you can make. The Team USA is going to play England on Friday if you were feeling bullish on America, pulling a 1776 and overcoming the British at their own game. You can go and place your bets there. I'm sure there are, I'm sure it's long odds for Team USA, but if you're feeling very patriotic for this U.S. men's national team, then you can go make your bets there. You want to make some bets on how the Rangers are going to do, if they're going to sign Aaron Judge. If you want to go make some bets there, head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more, because BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Now, Dayton Moore, the things he does well. He's been in baseball a lot. He's been running a front office a lot. He knows a lot of people. A lot of people know him. You can reach out to some people and tell Chris Young how to run things. But he is not in charge of this organization. I feel like it can get kind of muddled since he is senior advisor. He is advisor. He is not senior baseball operations president, whatever czar title that John Daniels held. Dayton Moore is not that. He is, it seems like, kind of more of a part-time role as a consultant of like, all right, if you need to bounce some ideas off me, here's what I've done in the past, here's what's worked or hasn't worked. And there has been a lot of that, and I think that was eventually what John Daniels was going to transition to had he not been fired unceremoniously after having to fire the manager 2 days before it, which, again, as you can tell, still pisses me off, and I think was unwarranted. But if you're going to bring in a guy, if you're going to fire John Daniels, that's fine. I get it. Doing it at that time was weird, and the reasoning was very clearly, I want to fire a bunch of people, and I can do that, and I'm going to. But if you're going to bring in a guy, James Click was literally right there. He's the former Astros GM. He just got fired after publicly saying that the Astros were only offering a one-year deal after winning the World Series, and he wanted a multi-year deal. And right now, pretty much all of the GM jobs are filled, so the only kind of role that he could have this year is senior advisor. You could bring him in. There is a lot of institutional knowledge with the Astros. There's a lot of things that they have done well, even if it's frustrating to admit. They have done a lot of things well, and a lot of things that the Rangers have not done well. Having a guy bring him in with that institutional knowledge and that hatred of the Astros that he probably has right now, because how do you fire your GM after you win the World Series and his assistant? It just doesn't make any sense. And it seems like Jim Crane, the Astros owner, is just going full Jerry Jones and like, I run this ship. I can do whatever the heck I want because I've won all these World Series and everything is going to last forever. And he might end up running it into the ground, which would be the absolute most hilarious thing to watch as a Rangers fan. But unfortunately, the Astros are really darn good, so it'd be really tough for him it'd take a little bit of time for him to run that thing into the ground with how well they have been run for the last few years. But that's why I am so frustrated that they didn't get James Click. And if you're going to bring in a guy, okay, I get it, but Moore has not done a great job with the Royals. I know they won a World Series, and it sounds like sacrilege to say, oh, well, if you won a World Series, then like everything must have gone right. Well, they haven't made the playoffs a whole lot. They haven't made the playoffs at all outside of those 2 years where they went to the World Series. They haven't done that since 1985. There's not been a whole lot of success. There was, they had the best minor league system at the time. It was like branded as a historical system, and they only went to the playoffs twice. The Rangers had, pretty good system, but at least went to the playoffs more than twice. They went to the back-to-back World Series. Granted, 2013, they missed out. I think that was the game 163 that happened there. Maybe that was a different year. Maybe that was 2017 that I'm getting mixed up. But anyway, 2014 was the abject terror year. In 2012, I think that was their best team, and they made the one-game wild card and got bounced in that one-game wild card. 2015 and 16, they won the division back-to-back years, and you're telling me that 2015 Rangers team wasn't better than that 2015 Kansas City Royals team? I think you'd be honestly pretty crazy. Their pitching staff in Kansas City that year, they had a really good bullpen. They had a really, really good bullpen and some mediocre starting pitching. Unfortunately, that includes Chris Young. He was not super great that year. They had Yordan Ventura as their number 2. He had a 4.08 ERA. Their ace was Edinson Volquez, age 31, who had a 3.55 ERA in 200 innings. And Jeremy Guthrie had a near 6 ERA, 5.95, as their pretty much number 3. And their offense was headed by a bunch of guys who had, basically 2 great seasons, got signed to these big, long contracts, and were never really all that good outside then. Lorenzo Cain had, his one really, really great offensive season. Pretty much everybody had career years in 2015 for the Royals, and that's why they won. I mean, Eric Hosmer had a couple other seasons outside of that where he was pretty darn good. Salvador Perez wasn't even that great that year. Mike Maddux had career season. Alex Gordon, career season. Kendrys Morales, pretty darn good year, and they traded for Ben Zobrist at the deadline. He kind of played all over everywhere, and they just kind of lucked and derped their way into a World Series that year. You look at the 2015 Rangers team, and I really do think that was a lot better. They had a much, much better offense. They had Robinson Chirinos, who had a great offensive year. Mitch Moreland had a career year. Ruben Odor was, had not fallen off a cliff just yet. Elvis Andrus was fine. Still had Adrian Beltre, had a little bit of a different version of Josh Hamilton, Shin-Soo Choo, and Prince Fielder was still there. And you had a little bit of Joey Gallo that year. Not a whole lot, but just a smidge of Joseph Nicholas Gallo. And Mike Napoli as well, coming into the deadline for basically nothing, and was pretty darn good in the 35 games that he played in. But the Rangers were solid. That 2015 team, like I said, with the Cole Hamels, Colby Lewis, Giovanni Gallardo rotation was pretty good, and the bullpen was good enough. I mean, it wasn't elite like the Royals bullpen, but like it was good enough. It was plenty good to win that year. Then okay, well, you look at 2016 team, and I think that Rangers team was better than this 2015 Royals team, 2010, 2011, 2012, heck, even 2013. I think all of those Rangers teams were better than that 2015 Royals team. But they got lucky. They got hot at the right time. They got their little slap hits to fall in, got a bunch of things to break their way, and a pretty good bullpen to close things out. Once it was a 1-run lead in the 6th or 7th inning, it was pretty much game over because their bullpen was just that good. And that isn't necessarily sustainable. That is the one thing that he's done very, very well. That is the one thing that Ryland Stiles of Locked On Royals will give him credit for, is building a good bullpen. And the Rangers could use that, building a good bullpen out of scratch. That is definitely something that I think is kind of the last sign of like teams trying to turn the corner into contention, is like pulling really good relievers out of their butt out of nowhere. That's something that Baltimore did really, really well this year. Just a lot of guys out of nowhere. They're just like, oh, wow, who is this guy? He's really good. And they just claimed him on the wire. Like Dylan Tate was absolutely amazing this year. Felix Bautista, who I think is going to get a lot of money in free agency. Seems like the Padres did that pretty well this year in their bullpen. But still, that is one of the things that is a good sign to have him on here. But there are a bunch of other scandals and things that have followed him around. He had a weird thing where he brought in 2018 this group that was an anti-porn group that was talking about how watching porn was, deteriorating people's minds and rewiring it, and just very, very harmful all over to people. Just kind of a weird moralizing thing for a GM to do. It's not really their job to do that, to be the moral police of a baseball team. Whatever your morals are, that's fine. But imposing them on people, he made it mandatory for his minor leaguers to attend, and he paid pretty sure used team money to bring this group in, and strongly encouraged for his major leaguers to come in and be a part of this. And then, that same year, he had some comments about Luke Heimlich, who, if you don't remember, Luke Heimlich was a guy who was a pitcher out of Oregon State, a left-hander, was probably going to go in the top 5 of the draft that year, but he was a convicted pedophile. That is a real thing that happened. And so teams were not going to draft him because you do not want to have a convicted pedophile on your team. And good. None of the teams should. But there is the comments that he made about him were, he said, we were, quote, very interested in him last year. Obviously, the accusation came out, so we immediately put everything on pause, gather facts, gather information. But he went out and performed last year. Not only did he achieve athletic excellence, he achieved academic excellence along the way. He went undrafted, all 30 teams. I think teams are still trying to find out more and more information. They're trying to come to grips with this. This is something that happened in their family. Their family has dealt with this. Their family remains very close today, all parties involved. It's a very complex deal, end quote. No, it doesn't seem like a very complex quote. It really doesn't seem like a very complex situation, and it did not seem like something that he needed to comment on at all. No one was forcing him to comment on this, but he decided to open his mouth and talk about it anyway. Just not a great move there, especially not from the guy who's trying to be the moral compass of his organization. And you look at what the organization has done in terms of developing guys. You look at the top 100 prospects in baseball. Look at Baseball Prospectus's top 50 at midseason. The Royals have no guys on there. None. Absolutely none. They have one guy on the MLB Pipeline's top 100, and it is Gavin Cross, an outfielder, a 21-year-old outfielder in A-ball, who is projected to get up in 2025. The only real development they've done is, well, they had a nice season for Bobby Witt Jr., which, again, pretty hard to screw that up. They've had so many top pitching prospects that pretty much none of them have worked out, except for Brady Singer was pretty good this year at a 3.23 ERA in around 150 innings as a 25-year-old. But other than that, they have not been able to develop pitching for crap. In the last several years, they have not been able to develop really position players either. They've not been able to make really good signings. It's just not been a lot of things that they have done well. They have the worst record in baseball since he took over. And they won a World Series and went to another World Series during that time. They had a 95-win season. They still have the worst record in baseball since he took over. That's not the guy that I would want to be hiring to teach my young GM how to be a GM. Unless you wanted to teach him, oh, here's what not to do. You see this guy? All his suggestions, go the other way with that. And there's an emotional component there. It seems like Chris Young likes to hire guys for these big positions that, he has a comfort level with, that he interacted with when he was a player. Bruce Bochy. Well, that I can't necessarily chalk that up to just being emotional. That was, I think, no matter who was the GM, that was the best hire available if you could convince him to come in, and that relationship did convince him to come in. But I think this is a move where it does seem a little more emotional, which was something that got Dayton Moore in trouble with Kansas City, of handing out these big contracts to guys like, oh, well, you won the World Series, so even though we know this is kind of a fluke year, you're never going to do this again, we're going to sign you this big old contract, and you're going to underperform. A lot of those guys that were key members of that World Series got big contracts either there or in other places and just completely underperformed. I mean, that year where they had, just the greatest system, Heroes, their top 10 in 2011, that was right around when it was peaking. You have number one prospect Mike Maddux, who has had like 3 pretty good seasons and a bunch of crap seasons. Eric Hosmer, who was just an absolute drain on the Padres. Locked On Padres host Javi Reyes just refused to say his name because he hated him so much. Mike Montgomery, Will Myers, John Lamb, Jake Odorizzi, Danny Duffy, Christian Colon, Chris Dwyer, Aaron Crow. Crow isn't even in baseball at this point, and, well, Jake Odorizzi is still in baseball and is fine, but Will Myers was the top prospect to end all top prospects and got traded like 17 different times and never ever really lived up to the expectations that he had as a youngster. Same with Moustakas and Hosmer. Alex Gordon was fine for a lot of years. Lorenzo Cain was fine for a couple years, but it's just seems like kind of a fluky season. Like, okay, well, because this guy won a World Series, we need to view him as the pinnacle. No, if you win 3 World Series, that is something like, all right, you can't really fluke your way into it. Even though those teams did all seem fluky, there is something to that Giants even year nonsense. And it is Bruce Bochy, and it is how the Giants structured themselves at that time. And I think that giving this guy a lot of credit, bring him into your organization as a kind of senior, here's how I did things, guy to bounce ideas off of. It just kind of shows, again, the Rangers were way too quick to fire John Daniels. If you're going to do it, then you had to have a backup plan in place, or you probably should have just brought in a different GM overall. If they just fired him and then fired Chris Young, because if you're keeping Chris Young on, then you kind of are still implicitly agreeing, okay, John Daniels had the right plan, so we're going to keep the guy who was kind of going to be his successor and is still going to keep that exact same plan on the tracks. But if you're going to fire him, then you might as well just blow it up and say, well, we got to start over and get somebody with a different plan, because that plan didn't work. This guy did a good job early on, but has stagnated ever since. And I think if the Rangers had just fired everybody and hired James Click as their GM, maybe that would be a good idea. I don't know. I like Chris Young. I'm glad he's getting a chance. And maybe this Dayton Moore hire won't have that big of an impact anyway. But I do very much want to end on the very positive note of bringing back Mike Maddux. That is a great sign. And very happy to have him back for, if nothing else, than the sentimentality and the fact that he's a pretty darn good pitching coach. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen today. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be back tomorrow on Thanksgiving, doing an episode kind of off the cuff of things that I am thankful for about the Rangers and baseball in general. And then on Friday, hopefully a Black Friday shopping list for position players if the Rangers want to go and spend some stupid money on some big position player free agents. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thank you all so much for listening, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.